Hello, class. This is preview lesson 212. You are to watch this prior to our class 0 to 12. That is, of course, the 12th week of our semester. It would really be helpful if you watched this even before you started reading through the books of Galatians through 2 Thessalonians. So let's get right to it. I want to put a screen up here for you to look at, a PowerPoint. And we are going to go through some key aspects of kind of background stuff regarding the different letters that Paul writes to the churches in Galatia, Ephesus, Philippi, and also Colossae and Thessalonica. So let's start with Galatia, what the region was like. We'll start there. First of all, we know that it's located in Central Asia Minor. Now, Asia Minor is where modern-day Turkey is. And it's actually a collection of cities and villages visited by Paul and Barnabas on his first missionary journey. And these are some of the villages and cities he visits: Perga, Pisidian, Antioch, Iconium, Lystra, and Derbe. And you can see those laid out for us in Acts chapter 13 through chapter 14. Again, reminder, be sure to be taking notes. All right, so that's kind of just an overview on Galatia itself. Now, why did Paul feel the need to write this letter specifically to the churches in this region? So there is the region we're talking about. There's Antioch, there's Iconium, Derbe, Lystra. All right, so Central Asia Minor. This is where he spent a lot of time on his first missionary journey. There you can see on his third missionary journey, he makes his way back. And again, this is a close-up on the first missionary journey. But on his third, he also makes his way back to that area because, again, of how special that region is to him. All right, let's talk about why he wrote this letter to the Galatians, to the churches in that region. First of all, he had gotten reports of misguided leaders there, leaders who had opposed, in fact, his own initial ministry. Both he and Barnabas in Galatia. And you can see that account in Acts chapter 13 as well as chapter 14 in those specific verses listed there. Well, those who had opposed them, these misguided leaders back on the first missionary journey, were now misleading the Christians in these churches with a false gospel. These are Jewish leaders, remember, who were not convinced that Jesus was the only one who could save them by his grace. So remember that. And so what they're dealing with here, what Paul is dealing with, is a false gospel, which was essentially that you needed to keep the Jewish law and the Jewish traditions in order to be saved. That was essential. And so as a result, we see the churches in this region, in Galatia, having an unhealthy obsession with God's law, not seeing it for what it really is. And instead, we're trying to obey it as a means of saving themselves. And so what Paul did was he decided, I need to write them. I need to reaffirm what the true gospel is, the one I initially preached to them, versus this altered and false gospel. And so the heart of the gospel message that Paul reaffirms is it's the free gift of Jesus' sacrifice for our sins that saves us. It's not keeping the law that saves. It's only Jesus who saves. So that's really a good setup for your own study of the book of Galatians. Now let's move on to Ephesus, because the letter of Ephesians is written to the church in Ephesus. Now, Ephesus, let's talk about the city. Now, for more details on his ministry in Ephesus, you can go back to Acts chapters 19 and 20. But it's a port city on the Aegean Sea. That's one thing that you need to know about Ephesus. And so there's an awful lot of business that takes place there. It's a capital city of the Roman province of Asia in what is now the extreme western part of modern-day Turkey. That's where Ephesus is. Its population was quite substantial, 500,000 at least. And there were many, many wealthy civic leaders, some that Paul called friends. We can see reference to this in Acts chapter 19. But the religious life of Ephesus is dominated by emperor worship and also by the occult and idolatry, these kinds of things. So this is something that Paul is obviously concerned with. The moral life, typical of many Greco-Roman cities, they had a large brothel, that is a house of prostitution, right at one of the major intersections of the town. In other words, it wasn't something that was frowned upon. It wasn't something that was hidden away somewhere. It was on full display as an accepted part of life. Now, the third aspect of Ephesus I want to highlight is the fact that it was a center of worship for the pagan Greek goddess of Artemis, or as she's referred to in Roman mythology, Diana. Artemis was the Greek name. Diana was the Roman name. And her temple was in fact considered one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. And Artemis, you may wonder, okay, so what was her place in the pantheon of gods and goddesses? Well, she was the goddess of childbirth and female maturation. In other words, if you wanted to have a large family, you needed to make sure you pleased the goddess Artemis or Diana. And she was also the goddess of hunting and wild animals. And for those who that was their livelihood, then that also was important for them to worship Diana. But really, that's something that you need to understand if you're going to go into the book of and the letter of Ephesians and really understand it. Now, why did, therefore, he write this letter specifically to Ephesus? So there it is, and it was on his 3rd missionary journey. We see that he spends quite a bit of time there, and right on the coast of Asia Minor. One thing you need to know about this city is that it is the first of 4 letters that Paul wrote from prison. And so it was a church that he established, as we just said, on that missionary journey that we mentioned there. But a few other things about Ephesus that you need to understand. It was to help those who used to bow to other powers, to Diana, that is Artemis, or any other god or goddess, to understand that the power of Christ was much greater. That's one of the major reasons why Paul writes this letter. Be looking for that as you study the book of Ephesians. And so he emphasizes in Ephesians 2, 8, 9, and 10 that it's his power, meaning the power of Christ alone, that saves and purifies us. It's his power alone that not only saves us and purifies us, but protects us from Satan's attacks. We see that on the passage about putting on the spiritual armor in chapter 6, verses 10 through 20. Another reason why Paul wrote this letter was to help the people there, because they saw all kinds of different versions of what it meant to be a family. He wanted to give them a better understanding of what the human family really was all about, and how moms and dads, how husbands and wives were supposed to, and as per to the design of God, to interact with one another. And he also wanted to give them a better sense of, therefore, what God's family was like and how it was also supposed to function. And so remember, that's an important principle, that the human family is meant to illustrate God's family. Marriage, especially, is to point us to how God relates to us. And you'll see that in greater detail in chapter 5, especially of Ephesians. Now, let's move on to another letter, the letter of Philippians, which is written to the church in Philippi. A little bit about the city. First of all, if you want more details on his ministry in Philippi, look in the 16th chapter of Acts, verses 12 through 40. And he founded this church, we'll find, on his 2nd missionary journey. That's one thing to understand. And it happened to be a town named for Philip II of Macedonia. Does anybody know who Philip II was? If you're saying he happened to be the father of Alexander the Great, you are correct. It was the site of a major Roman battle in 42 BC. And so soldiers from this and other battles happened to settle there. And in fact, that's a pattern we see for a number of towns throughout Europe. But it's an important commercial town. It's located on the Via Ignatia, which is a major highway, if you will, an east-west commercial highway. And so that meant that there was a lot of traders coming into town as well as leaving town. And so there it is, Philippi, right up here in the region of Macedonia, right, on the Aegean Sea there. It's not right on the coast, but it's close enough to it. And this is that's where the Via Ignatia would have been located. Why did he write this letter to the Philippians? Well, a couple of things. Again, just a reminder, it's one of 4 letters that he writes from prison, and that along with Ephesians, Colossians, and Philemon. He wanted to prepare them for his visit, for one. And he also wanted to thank them. He wanted to thank them for basically their help, because they were generous in providing him with certain things, with his financial needs and many other needs. So he wanted to just give a straight up thank you. Thirdly, he wanted to help them resist false doctrine like legalism, which was something that some of the other churches were facing as well, meaning keeping the law as a way to earn your salvation. That's legalism. The law is still important. We're still called to obey the 10 Commandments, but we don't do it in order to earn salvation. We do it because we are saved. So there's the difference, and he wants them to understand that. He also wanted to encourage the Philippian church to overcome any divisions that they were experiencing by reaffirming that their one true leader was Christ. He is the one head of the church. So that is why he writes Philippians. Be looking for these things when you read through the letter of Philippians. Now let's move on to the next letter, Colossians. Let's talk about the town of Colossae, about the city of Colossae. Well, for one, there are details lacking because this city has really not been excavated as of this moment. But it's, as far as we know, it's not a real large city, but it is located on an important north-south road in Asia Minor, about 100 miles southeast of Ephesus. And one of the reasons it may not be able to be excavated is that historically it's been plagued by earthquakes, and so it's been buried under one earthquake slide after another. So it might be quite some time before our archaeologists are able to uncover what remains of the city of Colossae. Now let's talk about why he wrote to the church in Colossae. First of all, there is the location of Colossae right here. These are the various churches of Asia Minor, and we'll talk more about that when we come to, by the way, the book of Revelation. Why did Paul write to the church in Colossae? Again, another prison letter. But even though this happened to be founded by Epaphras, or Epaphras, depending on how you want to pronounce his name, Paul wants to assure the Colossian church of his own interest and care. Remember how he felt responsible also for the Roman church, even though he had not yet visited it when he wrote a letter to them. But he also wanted to counter false teachings by reaffirming again who Christ is. The identity of Christ is crucial when you get through the letter of Colossians. And now I want to transition to the last set of letters we're going to look at. Excuse me, the letters of Thessalonians, the first one and the second one. So let's talk about Thessalonica as a city. First of all, it's a thriving seaport. It is a place that had many pagan temples, plus it even had a Jewish synagogue where, in fact, Paul and Silas themselves spoke. And there it is. You can see it right over here in Macedonia. Okay, so right there off the Aegean, that's where Thessalonica is. Now, why did Paul write both 1 Thessalonians and 2 Thessalonians? Well, the Thessalonian church had been founded amid a lot of opposition. We see that in Acts chapter 17, profiled for us. Paul and Silas themselves had to escape at night. Hostile parties even followed them to the next town. I mean, it was just a brutal, bloody affair. But one of the things we need to understand, the main reason is this, that he wrote both letters, which were only a few months apart, to encourage and instruct the new church in the face of the opposition they too were facing. Because it wasn't just something that Paul and Silas faced, it was something that every Christian was facing. And so you can see there are a lot of probably connection points between what you read in Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, to what we may be facing in some parts of the world. When I say we, I mean the church, in some parts of the world in terms of persecution. So pay attention to these facts that we just reviewed when you get into reading these letters. All right, that's everything I have for us right now. Thanks for your time. I hope you took good notes, and I'll see you in class.